Hi, welcome back. My name is Eleanor. This week, I really think of as a one book week. I read this book, which I cannot wait to talk about with you, The Sun Story by Marie-Hélène Lafon. But before I do that, I do want to make a point of telling you, because I'm doing the Emily Dickinson class and the Kafka class. If you know, you know. So I read Kafka's In the Penal Colony. Now, if you haven't read in the Penal Colony, it's very, very short. You can probably read it in about 20 minutes, and it's fantastic. It's very, very powerful. I'm not going to say anything else, just in case you haven't read it, and I want you to have the full experience. It is a horrifying read. It had a very strong physical effect on me. It made me nauseous. But because it's such a powerful work, and I also read somewhere, I forget where, that when it was read out loud at a certain point when it was first written, the several people in the audience had to leave the room, and a couple of women fainted. It isn't for the faint of heart. One of the great experiences is also that I read it in this book that I have. It's got this linen cover and black around it, and it's sort of bound almost as if Kafka had bound it himself. And it's just very beautiful to the touch. You see how it's just folded over, and it shows you really how simple a book can be. If you have just beautiful paper, beautiful print, it's just stunning. So here's the beginning. It's a remarkable piece of apparatus, said the officer to the explorer, and surveyed with a certain air of admiration the apparatus which was, after all, quite familiar to him. It is indeed a horror story. This particular book also has illustrations. They're lithographs by Michael Hafftka, but they're going to be extremely difficult for me to show you. But for example, here's one. So I very much recommend that. I also read another very short work by Kafka called The Burrow. If you want to read an extraordinary tracking of anxiety, read Kafka's The Burrow. I didn't get that word. I wish I'd come up with that word, tracking anxiety, myself, but it was someone in my class. Oh, it was such a good way to describe it. The Burrow has a protagonist who's tracking something, who knows what. But in reality, my classmates said, isn't he tracking his own anxiety? And I thought, yes, he is. That being said, The Burrow is probably the most boring piece of writing I have read. So on the one hand, it's incredibly repetitive and boring. On the other hand, it's extraordinarily riveting, in retrospect, riveting and interesting. And I think perhaps it's meant to be, because it's really showing you what anxiety does to a person. And I'm talking about not the regular anxiety, I'm talking about like extreme. I would say, in Kafka's time, he wouldn't have known any of these, he wouldn't have known this terminology. Psychoanalysis, I think, had just been brought up. Freud was the latest thing. But yes, it's it's also a remarkable read. And again, if you're looking for something to read that's going to be very quick but going to give you a lot to talk about, let's say you and a friend or you and a partner want to read something that will then, oh, don't worry, you'll have a lot to talk about over dinner. I mean, it may put you off your dinner as well. In any case, I am continuing with Emily Dickinson as well. And boy, I'm having the most wonderful time with it. And I will say, for anyone who's playing along and following through from the last video, I have had moments where I wake up in the morning and go, did I really compare Emily Dickinson to Rupi Kaur? And how did I do that? How is it that no one is leaving snarky comments for me? BookTube is remarkably nice. Yes, I thought it was a controversial idea, but I'm still proud of that video and I still agree with what I said up to a point. In any case, moving along. So how did I this week come across this book? How did I find this? So basically, as you know, I've been away. Obviously, I'm back. Welcome back, Eleanor. Thank you. I was browsing in a bookstore that was near where I was staying, and I noticed it because it was sort of put out with the new releases. It is a new release. I don't know if it's available in the US, but definitely in the UK and Australia. And I had when I was, if you remember, several videos back, I was waxing lyrical about this particular art critic, art writer called Stephanie Smee. He's Australian. He's now living in Boston, and he is a huge art writer. And in fact, I just got out of the library his latest book. So I had read his book on the art of rivalry, and I just finally got to the end of the queue waiting for this in my library, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. And now I'm not usually one to read these sort of huge art history books, but I will read anything that Stephanie Smee writes. He's that good. And when I had researched a little bit about him, I had discovered that he has a sister called Stephanie Smee, who is a translator. She translates from the French to English. And sure enough, if you see, The Sun's Story is translated by Stephanie Smee. And I thought to myself, well, I've got to get that. Also, it's a very short read. I'm a fan of short reads at the moment, as you can tell. So I decided to buy it. I'm so glad I did. It's not the usual thing I would pick up. I did pick it up primarily because of the translator. And I should say, you know, I've previously talked about how much BookTube loves translators and how thankful we are. And I feel that I'm also, by following through and kind of really paying attention to who's translating, it feels to me almost as if the translator can become a celebrity, a star in the literary world in their own right, which is as it should be. So now I don't know very much French, so I can't judge on the authenticity, but I can judge on what it's like, on the readability. And this is a book that reads in a very particular way, which I'll explain later, which I feel has to be thanks to the translation of Stephanie Smee. Because a bad translation, you can tell when it's a bad translation, really, even if you haven't read the original, I feel, because there's a certain tone and there's a certain way that a writer, in this case Marie-Hélène Lafon, is writing, that I imagine Stephanie Smee has tried to capture to the best of her ability, and I was very grateful for that. And I will leave a link to Stephanie Smee's website because she has translated several other books from French to English, which will be of interest, I'm sure. Now, in this case, why language is so important and why I've started talking about the language and the tone, why I've started talking about the language and the tone before I talk about what the book is about, is because that's the sort of book it is. And you can tell that from the very beginning because of the epigraph. And it's a quote from Valère Novarina from an interview in 2019. And it's as follows: language is our earth, our flesh. I always think of a project as akin to an excavation, an opening in the earth, and the development of a text, its progression, like a hike in the mountains. So Lafont, the writer of this, the French writer of this, in the original, is already setting the reader up, and she's already pointing to the fact that the language, the way she uses language as the author, but also the way language is used by the characters, is of primary importance. Now, the fact, can I also just say quickly, language is our earth, our flesh, brings me back again to Kafka's The Penal Colony. So again, go read The Penal Colony if you haven't, and if you have, you'll know what I'm talking about. In any case, it's a book that, if it wasn't for this particular way that Lafont writes, would be very easy to describe as a family saga, because it does span 100-year period, a century, from 1908 to 2008. There are short chapters. Each chapter is dated, and a family saga is not something that I enjoy reading. It's just a personal preference of mine. I'm not really into it. However, this is a different kind of family saga. So, like, usually when you're looking at a family, a generation by generation, a family tree per se, you're looking at who, what, where. So you have your characters, you have what they're doing, what the relationships are, and where they're located. Now, with this, the only thing that's static and clear is where you are geographically, and it's in France. It's in the rural area in the middle of France's Central Plateau. Now, Marie-Hélène Lafon is originally from the Cantal. Now, as someone who doesn't know anything about French geography, I had to do a bit of research, but suffice to say, the one thing you need to realize is that these family members, generation by generation, have as their focal point this area in south central France that's quite isolated. And in 1908, you first come across this house and this farm, and the name Chanterelle is the most important. And there is mention in the book quite a few times by the different characters of the mythical sound, the fairy tale sound, the musicality of the name Chanterelle. Now, I looked up. Chanterelle is a commune, which in France means a civil township, in the Cantal department, south central France. And the characters, when they move, usually move around. They usually stay within that area of Chanterelle, except when they move to Paris. And that is very, this specific geographical location and the role Paris plays from afar, plus the role that the two world wars play from afar. This is not, this is hardly a book about world wars, but there is that. So it's hardly about Paris, it's hardly about the world wars, and yet that is part of the unknowable aspect of many of these things, of many of the happenings in this book. It's called The Sun's Story, but it's not really about the one sun. It could be several suns, depending on what chapter you're reading. And now, while the geography is absolutely certain and real, time is very, very malleable. So you don't have a chronological order. You start at 1908, you do finish in 2008, but each chapter jumps back and forth. So it might go 1908, 1934, 1970, 1922, 1950. So it's jumping around. So this has a very specific effect on the reader. And so I found myself immersed in this world, but following the time, the chronological time that Lafont wants me to. So the artistry really has to be perfect in this case. And I feel it really is. Now, yes, it can get a bit confusing, but you really need to accept that. The confusion that got to me was more with the names of the characters. But once you write it down really quickly and you sort it out, you're really fine. And I still would rather have had that confusion originally, just because, you know, these people are related, and they even though they might be in different generations and not have known each other, or known each other very briefly, there is a very pleasing aspect to confusing them one with the other. Now, yes, it's the sun's story, but it's really also the story, and it's very, very subtle. It's the story of who is bringing up these young boys, or a young boy. I mean, there's not that many. But so who is bringing up a boy? Who is bringing them up when they're 4 or 5? Who does that young boy love? Who are they attached to? Who teaches them what they need? What is the role of a mother? What is the role of a father? And then also, as they grow up, how is this young boy educated? How does he learn about the world? And I think if there's one thing that I found the most stunning, there's so many stunning things in this tiny book, but the one thing that really captured my heart is the way Lafont is able to show how very beautiful and vulnerable and gentle and tender young boys are. Now, that's not to say that young girls are not as well, but if you've maybe spent time with a young boy, I'm talking about, maybe a 3-year-old, maybe a 2-year-old, maybe a 10-year-old, maybe a teenage boy, you're probably smiling and nodding your head. There's a certain vulnerability and sweetness. And I think it's because at a certain age, as they grow into men, within our society, and definitely within the society of this book, there's a hardening that inevitably occurs. And I suppose that's as it should be, because you grow up, you have responsibilities, and life is hard. Life is hard for everyone. Everyone's dealing with something. But there's something rather heartbreaking about that. Now, there's also the pressure that the adults around a young boy might feel. How do you want that child to grow up? Yeah? And I think nowadays in 2024, there's a lot of talk about being the best parent you can be and making all the sacrifices for your child. That's all very well and good. But what Lafont realizes and what she brings forth here through the particular way she narrates this story, and I'll go back to how she does it, the craft of it, because it's absolutely fascinating. If you're into the craft of a novel and the use of a third person narrative structure, I think this is an education in and of itself, but it's also a pleasure to read. I mean, I'm not a writer. I'm just enjoying it for itself. So what I'm going back to what I was saying. What were you saying, Eleanor? What were you saying? The what Lafont shows so beautifully is that all adults do not have the same capacity for being able to love a boy in the way he needs to be loved, show the love in the way the boy needs to have it shown. And while it's not more the domain of the mother than the father, in this specific time period of the book, it is. It is. And you do find that behind the son story is also the story of the women who have to really know themselves very well and know the women around them to gauge what's best for the young boy. So you may very well be the biological mother of a child. That doesn't necessarily mean that, if you have the capacity, the ability to love that child in the way that you want him to be loved. And perhaps you have someone else in your life. Perhaps you have a sister, perhaps you have a friend, perhaps you have a maid who just, we're talking about back in the early 20th century, for example, with the maid, I mean. And maybe there's this very strong connection, and it's a very beautiful connection, but it comes, it never comes easy. And I love it. I love this book. I love what it says about boys growing up. I love what it says about women and men trying to find their place in families. I love how it puts the outside world of career or war, being a soldier. It puts that, it's still there. It is in that sphere of their life, but it's all about the family structure, and it's all understated. So the way this narrator works, the magic of it is that you can see the different points of view of the different characters, but it's not as if the narrator is trying to jump into their skin or control them through the narrator's own language. The narrator, it feels like, exposes the characters briefly and then shuts the door again, so that as a reader you're kept on. First of all, it's an excellent read because you continuously wanting to learn more about them. But you're also aware of the limitations of the characters, because I think in every family tree, I'm generalizing, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct, there are going to be some personalities that just, they don't talk that much. And you don't know that much, and they're very, very private, and that is their right. But there's also this yearning of the son's son in this case, and the women around them, whether they be all the girl cousins. There's like a gaggle of girl cousins, there's a gaggle of sisters, there's very, very loving maternal figures. They're all trying to understand themselves and each other, as you, the reader, are trying to do that. It's very effective. I will say at one point I did think and compare this book to Cherie by Colette, and to the character of Leah. I have a whole video on that if you're new and you haven't watched it, which you may be interested in. Because it took me a while to realize that, if we're talking about a story that starts in 1908, we're around the time of Cherie and Leah, the story written by Colette. And that actually makes sense, and I don't want to do any spoilers, but it makes sense with a certain aspect. I think this is a very, if you enjoyed Cherie and After Cherie, I think you'll enjoy this very much. But with Cherie, Colette is a completely different writer from Lafont. So Colette's narrator is getting in there, and she is going to exuberantly go into detail about exactly what's going on in Cherie's mind, exactly what's going on in Leah's mind. This is much more subtle, much more reserved, and it's an interesting contrast. Now, it sounds like this might be boring. Like, what makes it so propulsive? What made it a page turner for me? It started off a little bit slow, but what it is that there is a very strong, very emotional, inciting incident in the first chapter. And that propels you along somehow, because it takes your heart and wrenches it. I didn't know what to expect. There's almost nothing written about it in English that I can find, which is good because it forced me to think for myself. I don't know if any of you have this habit. I have a habit of, after reading something, because I have ideas, questions, I'm not quite sure what I'm thinking, I immediately go to the internet and I start searching. I read reviews, I read professional reviews, I go to Goodreads, I go to BookTube. It's a bad habit I'm trying to stop myself from because it's important to be able to think for yourself. And so this really forced me to think for myself. Now, it did win an award. It was the winner of the Prix Renaudot in, I think, 2020, when it came out originally in the French. So yes, I highly recommend that. It really took up a lot of emotional space in my week, and I'm very glad that it did. I'm really happy also to discover that Stephanie Smee has brought so much into my life, just as her brother Sebastian Smee has. And that's a surprising place I find myself in, which I don't think would have come about if not for BookTube, if not for the fact that I was encouraged by, the group of booktubers who started the art reading tag. I was encouraged to read more about art, and that reminded me of Sebastian Smee and brought me to his sister Stephanie. So that's it for now. I hope you're all well. I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.